I think we all agree this is the best solution for the community.
Sir, step away from the cabin and keep your hands where I can see them. The deputy's flashlight cut through the fog rolling off Blackwater Lake, while rain hammered the metal roof above us hard enough to drown out the dock, chains rattling in the wind. Vanessa Holloway stood 20 feet away in a cream-colored rain jacket that probably cost more than my first pickup truck, one hand on her hip, the other holding her phone high, like she was directing a crime scene instead of causing one. That's him. She snapped into the live stream she'd started for the HOA Facebook group. He's been trespassing here all morning. Behind her, half the neighborhood had gathered along the gravel driveway under umbrellas and truck tailgates, watching like Friday night football. Nobody spoke. You could smell wet cedar, lake mud, and fresh rain mixing with diesel exhaust from the county cruiser parked crooked near the fishing dock. I looked past the deputy toward the cabin lights glowing through the fog and said calmly, "Deputy, before you remove me from my own property, you might want to ask her one question." Vanessa laughed immediately, sharp and smug. "Your property?" she said loud enough for the crowd to hear. "That cabin's been HOA managed for 6 years. Then she smiled at the deputy like she already knew how this would end. "He showed up this morning claiming ownership and threatening residents." That part wasn't true, but people shifted anyway. That's how fear works in neighborhoods like Hollow Creek Estates. Nobody wants to be the next person publicly targeted by the HOA president. The deputy adjusted his rain collar and looked at me again. "Sir, do you have ID?" I handed him my wallet slowly while cold lake wind pushed fog across the shoreline, so thick the dock posts kept disappearing into gray. Vanessa folded her arms tighter when she saw how calm I was. That bothered her more than yelling ever would have. "You people always think paperwork changes reality," she muttered. I almost smiled at that because paperwork was exactly what was about to destroy her. About 30 seconds later, another set of headlights rolled up the driveway. County assessor truck. White Ford F-250 with mud halfway up the doors. The second it stopped, I noticed something important. Vanessa's expression changed. Just slightly. Tiny crack. Tiny hesitation. The kind you only catch if you spend years watching people lie professionally. A man in a brown county jacket stepped out holding a coffee thermos and a waterproof folder tucked under one arm. He looked straight at the cabin, then at me, then at Vanessa. Nobody moved. Even the livestream comments on her phone had gone quiet. Rain drummed against the dock roof, while thunder rolled somewhere across the lake. "Ma'am," the county assessor said carefully, "when exactly did the HOA start claiming parcel 14C?" Vanessa opened her mouth, but nothing came out right away. And standing there in the cold morning rain with 40 people watching her confidence slip inch by inch, I finally realized something important. This wasn't just a misunderstanding about property lines anymore. Vanessa Holloway had been using this land for years like nobody would ever come back for it. Comment below with your city and tell me honestly, what would you do if someone called 911 to throw you off land you legally owned? Vanessa recovered faster than most people would have. I will give her that. The second the county assessor asked about parcel 14C, she straightened her posture, tucked damp hair behind one ear, and slipped right back into that polished HOA voice like she was chairing another monthly board meeting instead of standing ankle-deep in mud beside a disputed lake property. "The association has maintained this parcel continuously for years," she said calmly. "Everyone here knows that." The problem was nobody answered her. Rain kept tapping against truck hoods and metal dock rails while fog drifted low across the water thick enough to swallow the far shoreline. I watched residents glance at each other without speaking. Some avoided looking at Vanessa altogether. That was new. 15 minutes earlier, they had been filming me like I was some drifter trying to break into a community cabin. Now people looked uncertain, uncomfortable, embarrassed they might have backed the wrong person publicly. The county assessor opened the waterproof folder slowly. "Maintenance does not establish ownership, ma'am." His tone stayed neutral, but the deputy beside him shifted his weight immediately. Small movement. Big change. Vanessa noticed too. Her smile tightened at the corners. "Well, perhaps your office records are outdated," she said. "That happens all the time in probate situations." She said probate carefully, testing the word to see if it scared people the way legal language usually does in HOA meetings. But this time it landed wrong because I answered before the assessor could. "The probate closed 8 months ago." Silence again. You could hear rainwater dripping off the cedar roof behind us, and waves knocking softly against the dock posts below. Vanessa turned toward me slowly. First real irritation. Then why did nobody inform the association? She asked. There it was. Not concern. Not confusion. Possession. Like the land should have reported to her personally before changing hands. I felt something cold settle in my chest hearing that because suddenly my father's cabin did not feel abandoned anymore. It felt occupied, controlled, rewritten by someone who thought enough time and confidence could erase ownership entirely. A lifted Chevrolet pickup rolled halfway down the gravel drive, then stopped when the driver recognized the county truck. More residents arriving. More witnesses. Vanessa hated uncontrolled audiences. You could see it in the way her eyes kept scanning faces now instead of locking onto me. Grant Mercer? An older voice called from near the shoreline. I turned and recognized Walter Grady standing under a green canvas raincoat beside the bait freezer. 70, if he was a day. Lived 3 roads over. Fished Blackwater Lake every morning before sunrise. He looked nervous speaking up at all. Your daddy built that dock back in '98, he said quietly. I remember helping unload the lumber. Vanessa snapped toward him so fast, even the deputy noticed. Walter, this is not helping. Passive-aggressive smile again. Tight. Controlled. Nobody asked for folklore. Walter looked down immediately after that, embarrassed like a schoolboy getting corrected in class. And watching that old man shrink under her voice flipped something inside the crowd, because 2 women near the mail kiosk started whispering openly. One of them said, loud enough for everyone to hear, I thought the HOA bought this place. Vanessa heard that too. Her confidence cracked another inch. The county assessor finally removed a folded survey map from the folder and held it against the hood of his truck while rain rolled down the windshield beside us. Orange highlighter lines cut straight through the cabin lot, fishing dock, and half the gravel parking area the HOA had apparently been using for summer events. The deputy let out a low breath through his nose. Jesus. Vanessa stepped closer immediately. That map is preliminary. No, the assessor replied without looking up. It is certified. That word hit harder than thunder rolling over the lake a second later, because suddenly people were not looking at me anymore. They were looking at Vanessa Holloway like they were seeing her clearly for the first time. Nobody left after that. That was the first thing Vanessa Holloway did not expect. Normally, when she shut somebody down at an HOA meeting or cornered them with violation notices, people scattered fast because nobody wanted proximity to conflict in Hollow Creek Estates. But the second the county assessor said the survey was certified, the entire mood along the shoreline changed from curiosity to appetite. Residents stayed planted in the rain beside pickup trucks and golf carts watching for what came next. The same way, people slowed down beside a wreck even when they know they should keep driving. Vanessa sensed it too. You could see her trying to regain control of the audience before control slipped completely away from her. Everyone needs to calm down, she said sharply, stepping closer to the assessor's truck. This is obviously an administrative issue that will be resolved privately. Privately. There was the real panic finally leaking through. Because nothing terrified HOA people more than public scrutiny. Especially not Vanessa. Her authority only worked when conversations happened behind closed doors with selective emails and carefully edited meeting minutes. Public conflict was dangerous. Witnesses were dangerous. The deputy folded his arms against the cold and looked toward me instead of her now. Another shift. Small but important. Mr. Mercer, he said, how long have you held title? Before I answered, Vanessa cut in immediately. That is not relevant to whether he threatened residents this morning. Manipulation. Redirect. But nobody followed her this time. Rain rolled harder across the lake, drumming against the cabin roof while fog pressed tighter around the shoreline like the whole property was holding its breath. I pulled my keys from my coat pocket slowly and held up the old brass cabin key my father used to keep hanging beside our kitchen refrigerator for almost 20 years. My family built this place in 1998, I said. My father paid taxes on it until he died. Vanessa let out a soft laugh meant for the crowd. That does not make you the owner. No, I replied calmly. The probate judgment did. That landed differently because people around us had started connecting timelines in their heads now. The HOA summer cookouts, the fishing tournaments, the private wedding Vanessa rented the shoreline for last October. You could almost hear the calculations happening behind people's eyes. A younger guy near the mailbox kiosks finally spoke up. Wait, The HOA charged us $300 to reserve this dock for events. Vanessa snapped toward him instantly. Trevor, this is not the time. But he kept going because fear was weakening now that somebody official stood there with county paperwork. You said the association owned all the lake access. Silence spread again except for thunder rolling low across the water. Vanessa crossed her arms tighter against the rain, but her posture had changed completely. Earlier, she looked like a woman conducting enforcement. Now she looked like somebody trying to outrun a story before it reached full speed. The county assessor removed another document from the folder, this one laminated against the rain. There is another issue here, he said carefully. That sentence hit the crowd harder than yelling would have, because everybody understood tone in small towns. Officials only used careful voices when liability entered the room. Even Vanessa stopped moving for a second. Parcel 14C was never transferred into recreational zoning, the assessor continued, which means commercial events on this property may not have been legally permitted. A woman standing near the dock actually whispered, "Oh my God." And suddenly the problem was no longer just ownership. People started realizing there might be insurance exposure, permit violations, and HOA dues tied to land the association never legally controlled in the first place. Vanessa saw the exact moment the crowd turned emotionally because several residents who had been standing near her drifted backward toward the trucks without realizing they were doing it. Distance. Social instinct. Nobody wanted to stand too close to the person things were collapsing around. Vanessa noticed. Her face stayed composed, but for the first time since I arrived at Blackwater Lake that morning, she stopped looking powerful. The rain finally started easing about 10 minutes later, but somehow the silence got heavier when the thunder moved farther out across Blackwater Lake. People were no longer talking over each other now. They were thinking. That was worse for Vanessa. Fear and confusion she could manage. Quiet calculations spreading through a crowd were dangerous because once homeowners started mentally connecting money to liability, loyalty disappeared fast. I could see it happening in real time beside the dock. Couples whispering. Residents checking phones. Somebody had already pulled up old HOA newsletters showing photos from shoreline events Vanessa organized on this property. One man near the gravel drive muttered, "My daughter got married here last fall." Nobody answered him because everybody else was suddenly remembering checks they had written to the association. Event fees, dock rentals, holiday fundraiser tickets. The county assessor closed the folder and looked directly at Vanessa. "Ma'am, did the board disclose to residents that the parcel ownership was unresolved?" Vanessa's jaw flexed slightly before the smile returned. Controlled again, but thinner now. The board acted in good faith based on historical community usage. That sounded polished enough to almost work until Walter Grady spoke again from near the bait freezer. That is not true. Every head turned toward him because people like Walter almost never interrupted public conflict. The old man pulled his rain hood back, exposing gray hair flattened by lake mist. Your maintenance crew tore down Grant's father's old property markers 3 summers ago. Vanessa froze for half a second. Tiny pause. But enough. "Walter," she said quietly. "I think you are confused." "No," he replied. "I helped put those markers in back in 2002. The emotional shift hit the shoreline immediately. Residents who had looked uncertain before suddenly looked embarrassed. That was the first real social fracture. Confusion turning into betrayal. Vanessa sensed it and changed tactics instantly. "You are all reacting emotionally," she said to the crowd, voice rising slightly above the rain dripping off cedar branches. "The association improved this property. We cleaned it up. We made it safe." There it was again. Possession disguised as stewardship. Like effort created ownership. I looked past her toward the cabin porch where somebody had hung cheap string lights around the railing for HOA summer parties. My father used to sit there with a black coffee thermos before sunrise listening to fishing boats idle through the fog. Seeing that porch turned into community event space hit harder than I expected. Not anger exactly. Exhaustion. The kind that settles behind your ribs when you realize strangers have been rewriting your family history while calling it management. The deputy noticed my expression shift. "You all right, Mr. Mercer?" he asked quietly. "No," I answered honestly. "But I am getting there." That line changed something else too because people finally stopped seeing me as an outsider challenging the HOA and started seeing what this actually was. Somebody coming back to find his family property absorbed by people who assumed nobody would fight them. Vanessa realized the crowd was emotionally drifting away from her, and desperation finally started leaking through the polish. "Grant," she said suddenly, softer now, almost personal, "there is no reason to create a public spectacle over a misunderstanding." I almost laughed hearing that, because she had literally called 911 in front of half the neighborhood less than an hour earlier. Trevor, the same resident who mentioned dock rental fees earlier, looked at her in disbelief. "You live-streamed the whole thing, Vanessa." That landed hard. A few people actually looked away from her after that. Public shame spreading. She opened her mouth to answer when another county vehicle turned slowly onto the gravel drive, tires crunching through wet stone. Different department this time. White SUV with zoning enforcement printed on the side door. And the second Vanessa saw it, real fear finally crossed her face for the first time all morning. The zoning officer stepped out carefully, letting the SUV door thump against puddles on the gravel driveway, water splashing into the mud where my boots had already sunk. He carried a black binder, soaked slightly at the corners, and when he set it on the hood of my old Ford Ranger, the wind shifted across the lake, bringing with it the scent of wet pine needles and fog pressed thick against the shoreline. Vanessa Holloway straightened, eyes narrowing in a controlled but visible irritation, her polished confidence slipping just enough for a pulse of panic to show through the veneer. "This is unnecessary," she said sharply, voice clipped, scanning the crowd now swelling along the perimeter, neighbors standing under umbrellas, leaning on pickup beds, eyes darting nervously between us. "I have maintained this property under association oversight for years," she added, attempting to reclaim authority as her fingers clenched the railing of the dock, white knuckles in contrast to her raincoat. I stepped forward slowly, calm but deliberate, and said, "That maintenance was without legal claim. You used community funds, coordinated events, and controlled access here for years, but ownership never transferred. You assumed permission equaled right." The words carried over the water with a weight that caused a few residents to whisper under their breath, subtle nods acknowledging the discrepancy they had overlooked. Fog curled around the metal roofs of nearby cabins as I walked toward the dock, coffee thermos swinging lightly in my hand, rain dripping from the brim of my hat onto the wooden planks. A woman near the shoreline, clutching a woven basket, tilted her head toward the county officer, whispering about fees she had paid last summer for the event Vanessa organized. A man by the fishing pier shook his head, murmuring to his wife about unpaid invoices and permission slips never signed. The social pressure mounted visibly, bodies shifting, neighbors subtly backing away from Vanessa. I glanced at her briefly. The smile was still there, but the corners were tighter, eyes flicking rapidly as if counting escape routes and witnesses simultaneously. "Grant," she said, attempting manipulation, voice soft now, but loaded with entitlement. "You are making this public unnecessarily. There are proper channels." I responded evenly. Proper channels rely on truth, and the truth is right here on the map, backed by the assessor and certified documents. The deputy next to me exhaled audibly, small motion, but enough to show a power shift. Vanessa's hand brushed against the side of her phone, live stream continuing. But the spectators were no longer passive. They were analyzing, murmuring, observing the fissures appearing in her control. Across the muddy shoreline, a pickup truck engine idled quietly, neighbors leaning into the hood to glimpse the binder. "We were told the HOA owned the dock and this parcel." A voice called out from near the cedar trees, trembling slightly under the pressure of social accountability. Vanessa's response was delayed, clipped, almost panicked in its composition. Those claims were based on historical management. Another whisper, another side-eye among residents, and the fog seemed to thicken as if holding its breath. I looked out across the water, scanning each face, noting internal recalibration. The community realizing mismanagement, entitlement, and unchecked power had been applied in their midst. Each glance away from Vanessa, each soft mutter, each careful assessment of her position in the crowd shifted dynamics further, creating a layered social consequence that would linger long after the rain stopped. Thunder rolled low, vibrations through the shoreline wooden planks, and I stepped onto the dock fully, the assessor opening another page of evidence while Vanessa adjusted her posture repeatedly, confidence fraying under the organic pressure of observation, exposure, and community recognition that the balance of power had irreversibly moved. The fog pressed tighter over the water as I stepped back from the dock, boots sinking slightly into the muddy shoreline. And for the first time that morning, I let my exhaustion settle into strategy rather than frustration. Rain pattered against the metal roof above the cabin, and the county assessor leaned against his white Ford, binder open, thumbs lightly tracing highlighted lines that no longer required explanation. Vanessa Holloway tried to reclaim composure, sweeping her gaze across the crowd, speaking louder, sharper. "Grant, this is going too far. You cannot make county officials arbitrate private disputes in this manner." Her entitlement carried the weight she intended, but now it sounded thin, tested. I adjusted the thermos strap across my shoulder and gestured toward the binder. "Ma'am, I am not requesting arbitration. I am presenting evidence of legal ownership, zoning violations, and potential liability for the association's use of this parcel without proper permits." The words landed with a heavier presence than any argument could have, resonating against the fog and the faint echo of thunder off the lake. Residents shifted, subtle murmurs threading through the crowd as they leaned on trucks and dock railings, eyes flicking between documents, assessor, and Vanessa. One woman whispered about fees she had paid for HOA-sanctioned events that had occurred on this land. Vanessa's lips pressed tighter, and for the first time, a twitch of irritation flashed across her face. "That is irrelevant to the discussion at hand," she said, voice elevated just enough to try to reclaim dominance, but the social momentum had already shifted. I crouched slightly to point to a section of the map on the hood of the Ranger, fog curling at our ankles, wind carrying the scent of wet cedar from across the shoreline, and continued evenly. The permits for those events were never issued under the current zoning classification, and your board used association funds to host and maintain these facilities without proper insurance coverage. That constitutes exposure for every resident who participated or contributed. The deputy shifted, expression subtle but observably more aligned with my stance. Vanessa glanced at him, then out at the crowd, realizing the public perception was no longer entirely under her control. "You are implying wrongdoing," she said, passive-aggressive and clipped, trying to sound controlled while sweat dampened her hairline under the hood. I allowed a pause, letting fog settle between us as thunder rolled across the lake, the rhythmic drip of rain on the cabin roof and the gravel driveway punctuating the silence, and said softly, "I am not implying anything. I am presenting factual evidence, supported by county records and certified permits, of actions taken on property you do not own." The crowd exhaled collectively, shifting on muddy ground, whispering about exposure, liability, and the audacity of prior events on land that was suddenly not just someone else's claim, but legally documented ownership. Vanessa's fingers tightened on the railing. Her eyes flicked repeatedly to the documents and then to the neighbors leaning in, absorbing each word. Her composure frayed in increments, subtle but visible, and with every calculated breath I took, the power narrative swung more firmly into my control. "Ma'am," I said, voice measured and calm. "The next step is simple. Cease unauthorized usage, notify the community of the correct ownership, and address any insurance or zoning discrepancies immediately. County offices are already prepared to document all compliance and exposure." I did not raise my voice. I did not step closer. I let the wind, fog, and social momentum carry the weight. Residents' eyes, previously cautious and hesitant, now sought her reaction, gossip humming along the shoreline like electrical energy through the fog. Her smile tightened, a twitch, hesitation, and finally a subtle acknowledgement that her authority had been publicly challenged by documents and legal reality, and the first real cracks appeared across the polished surface she had maintained for years. The emotional collapse did not happen all at once. That was the strange part. It happened in inches, in silence, in people quietly deciding where they stood while cold wind rolled fog across Blackwater Lake and rainwater dripped from the dock roof in slow, steady taps that sounded louder now that nobody trusted Vanessa Holloway anymore. She felt it before she fully understood it. You could see her scanning faces looking for reinforcement and finding hesitation instead. Residents who normally hovered near her at HOA meetings had drifted toward the gravel driveway beside the county trucks. Nobody stood directly beside her now except the deputy, and even he kept his attention on the assessor's binder rather than Vanessa herself. The isolation was becoming visible. A woman in a red raincoat folded her arms and said quietly to her husband, "She told us Grant abandoned this place." Vanessa heard that. Her jaw tightened instantly. That was the understanding based on years of inactivity. She replied sharply, but her timing was off now. Too fast. Too defensive. The crowd noticed. People always notice confidence changing shape. Trevor shoved his hands into his sweatshirt pockets and looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Vanessa, you charged residents maintenance fees for this shoreline every quarter." Another resident chimed in immediately after that. "And special assessment money for dock repairs." The whispers spread harder after that, bouncing across the shoreline like sparks. Numbers, fees, event rentals, insurance questions. Nobody was yelling, which somehow made it worse. It sounded like diner conversations after a town scandal breaks. Low voices, quiet disbelief, public trust draining away one sentence at a time. Vanessa tried to regain control by shifting into that polished board president tone again. "Everyone needs to stop speculating before legal counsel reviews the situation." Nobody answered her. That silence hit harder than accusations would have. The kind of silence where people stop treating you like authority and start treating you like liability. Fog drifted through the cedar trees while the zoning officer flipped another page inside the binder and spoke without emotion. The association also submitted 2 permit applications listing this parcel as community-controlled recreation space. Vanessa turned toward him immediately. Because operationally, it functioned that way. Operationally, the officer repeated flatly. That single word embarrassed her more than a direct argument could have, because several residents actually looked away, trying not to react. I watched her carefully then because this was the first moment she stopped acting like a woman protecting authority and started acting like someone trying to survive public humiliation. Her breathing changed. Faster. Shallower. She crossed her arms tighter against the cold lake wind, but it looked less like confidence now and more like self-protection. I felt anger still sitting in my chest, but it had transformed into something steadier. Strategic. My father used to say people reveal themselves fastest when they lose control slowly in front of witnesses. Standing there watching neighbors quietly distance themselves from Vanessa Holloway, I finally understood what he meant. Walter Grady stepped closer beside me near the dock railing and said softly enough that only I could hear, "Your dad would have hated what they turned this place into." That one landed harder than all the legal documents combined. For a second, I could hear old memories underneath the rain. Fishing lines cutting through fog before sunrise. Coffee thermos lids clicking open on cold mornings. My father sanding cedar boards on this exact dock while country radio played from a rusty toolbox. Vanessa interrupted the moment suddenly, voice brittle now. "Grant, if your intention is retaliation, just say that." I looked at her for a long second while thunder rolled low beyond the water and residents stood frozen waiting for my answer. "No," I said calmly. "My intention is for the truth to stop being optional around here." And judging by the way nobody defended her after that, the community had already decided which side of the story they believed. By late afternoon, the rain had thinned into a cold mist, but Blackwater Lake still felt heavy, like the entire shoreline was waiting for something official to finally break loose. The crowd had not disappeared. If anything, more residents had shown up after word spread through the neighborhood Facebook group that county officials were investigating the dock property live in front of witnesses. Pickup trucks lined both sides of the gravel driveway now, headlights glowing through fog rolling low over the water. Nobody treated Vanessa Holloway like the center of authority anymore. They watched her the way people watch a restaurant manager after the health inspector arrives. Careful, curious, already emotionally detached. Vanessa stood near the mail kiosk with her arms folded tight against the damp cold, trying to maintain posture even while residents quietly avoided standing beside her. Every few minutes, somebody's phone buzzed with another HOA group message, and another wave of whispers spread across the shoreline. Questions about fees, insurance, board approvals. Somebody even uploaded screenshots from old newsletters advertising exclusive HOA lakefront access, beside photos of my father's cabin in the background. Vanessa noticed those whispers immediately. "People need to stop posting misinformation online," she snapped suddenly. This situation is under review. But the sentence fell flat because right as she said it, another vehicle turned down the drive. Black County SUV this time. Sheriff's office seal on the side door. That changed the atmosphere instantly. Even the zoning officer straightened. A tall deputy sheriff stepped out first, followed by a woman in a charcoal raincoat carrying a leather folder against her chest. County investigator. Mid-50s maybe. Sharp eyes. Calm face. The kind of person who made people nervous by speaking softly instead of loudly. Vanessa's expression collapsed for half a second before she forced the smile back again. Sheriff involvement seems excessive, she said carefully, but nobody responded. The investigator walked straight past her toward the assessor's truck while fog drifted between the cedar trees and thunder rolled somewhere far across the county line. I am Investigator Dana Pike, she said evenly. We received a referral regarding potential misrepresentation of property ownership connected to association financial activity. That sentence hit the shoreline like a pressure drop before a storm. Residents immediately started murmuring harder. Somebody near the dock whispered, "Financial activity?" Another homeowner muttered, "Oh, this is bad." Vanessa stepped forward quickly. "This is becoming absurd." The association acted in good faith based on historical maintenance patterns. Dana Pike opened the leather folder slowly without looking up. "Mrs. Holloway, according to county records, your board submitted reimbursement requests, event permits, and vendor contracts identifying this parcel as HOA-controlled property over a 4-year period." Silence. Total silence except for rainwater tapping metal dock cleats below us. Vanessa tried to answer immediately but stumbled over the first sentence. That classification was operationally accepted by prior boards. "There are no prior boards listed on these submissions," Dana replied calmly. "Only your signature." That one broke the social atmosphere completely. Residents physically stepped away from Vanessa after hearing it. Not dramatically, quietly, instinctively, like people realizing smoke is actually fire. Trevor looked sick standing near the shoreline. Walter Grady shook his head slowly beside me without saying a word. I could feel the emotional gravity shifting across the entire property now. Not toward conflict anymore, toward accountability. Vanessa turned toward me then, eyes sharp with panic hiding underneath anger. "You planned this," she said softly. I looked out across the fog-covered water where my father used to fish before sunrise and answered just as quietly, "No, I just came back for what was mine. The rest happened because you could not stop pretending it was yours." And standing there while county investigators opened folders beside sheriff deputies and half the neighborhood watched her authority unravel in silence, Vanessa Holloway finally looked like a woman realizing public control and legal control were never the same thing at all. 3 weeks later, the emergency HOA meeting looked nothing like the polished neighborhood gatherings Vanessa Holloway used to control with scripted agendas and fake smiles. Rain hammered the community center roof hard enough to rattle the fluorescent lights, while folding chairs scraped nervously across the floor and residents whispered in tense little clusters like people waiting outside a courtroom. Nobody sat near Vanessa anymore. That might have been the most satisfying part. She sat alone at the end of the board table beneath the framed Hollow Creek Estate sign, shoulders tight. Legal pads stacked in front of her like paper could still protect her from what had already happened. Outside, fog pressed against the windows from the lake and pickup truck headlights cut through the rain across the parking lot. Inside, the atmosphere felt heavy with embarrassment. Not mine. Hers. Dana Pike stood near the front beside 2 sheriff deputies while the county assessor quietly reviewed documents with the remaining board members, all of whom suddenly looked exhausted and much older than they had a month earlier. Nobody joked. Nobody made small talk. Even the coffee station near the back wall sat untouched. That silence told the whole story. Vanessa tried one last time anyway. "The board acted collectively," she said carefully, voice softer now, almost brittle. "Any administrative misunderstandings regarding Parcel 14C were procedural in nature." Trevor actually laughed under his breath hearing that, and several residents looked down immediately to hide their reactions. Dana Pike opened her folder without emotion. "Mrs. Holloway, the investigation found repeated instances of knowingly misrepresenting private property as association-controlled land on permit applications, vendor contracts, and resident fee notices." Vanessa swallowed hard. "I never personally benefited." "The records disagree," Dana replied calmly. Then came the final collapse. Vendor reimbursements tied to private shoreline events. Unauthorized maintenance contracts approved under her signature. HOA dues redirected toward improvements on property the association did not legally control. Every sentence stripped another layer off the image she spent years building. Residents stopped looking angry at that point. They looked embarrassed they trusted her for so long. One by one, the remaining board members voted to suspend her pending formal civil review. No dramatic shouting. No screaming meltdown. Just quiet hands raised across a room filled with rain, noise, and humiliation. Vanessa looked around after the final vote like she expected somebody to defend her. Nobody did. Walter Grady stared at the floor. Trevor would not even make eye contact. The woman in the red raincoat who used to organize HOA cookouts physically turned her chair away from Vanessa before the meeting even ended. Social authority gone. Completely gone. Afterward, I drove back to Blackwater Lake alone through cold fog drifting across the county roads. The shoreline looked different without temporary HOA signs cluttering the gravel entrance. Quieter. Honest again. I unlocked the cabin myself just before sunrise the next morning while mist rolled low across the water and cedar boards creaked softly beneath my boots. For the first time in years, the dock belonged to my family again instead of somebody else's illusion of control. I stood there with my father's old coffee thermos warming my hands while fishing boats moved silently through the fog beyond the shoreline. No crowds. No deputies. No arguments. Just cold lake wind, wet cedar, and peace returning 1 inch at a time. A month later, the county formally revoked all unauthorized recreational permits tied to the property. Residents filed civil complaints against the HOA board for financial misrepresentation. Vanessa quietly listed her house for sale before winter. Nobody organized a farewell gathering. Nobody posted supportive messages online. The same community she controlled through fear and embarrassment moved on without her almost immediately. That was the real irony. People like Vanessa Holloway spend years believing authority makes them untouchable when most of it only exists because other people stay quiet. The second the truth becomes public, power disappears fast. Looking back now, this was never really about one dock or one cabin on a foggy lake. It was about boundaries. About what happens when entitlement grows unchecked long enough that somebody mistakes management for ownership and control for legitimacy. My father used to say the easiest way to expose somebody's character was to calmly force them into the truth in front of witnesses. He was right. Vanessa did not collapse because I yelled louder than she did. She collapsed because the truth finally stopped happening behind closed doors. And standing there that morning watching fog drift across restored shoreline property my family almost lost forever, I realized something else too. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge is simply refusing to let dishonest people rewrite what belongs to you. Rank the story from 10 to 0. I would love to know what you think.